Sir, take your daughter and leave. This place isn't for people like you. The manager's voice echoed across Aldrich's restaurant. Every table went quiet. Ryan didn't argue. He just stood there in his cleanest button-down shirt, his work boots still marked with stains from a job he couldn't afford to lose. Beside him, Sophie held his hand tightly, wearing the same blue birthday dress her mother bought before she disappeared from their lives. Ryan gently placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Hey, it's okay," he whispered. "Nothing's wrong." Sophie didn't cry. She just looked around the silent room, until a woman at the corner table suddenly pushed back her chair and stood up. 3 weeks before that evening, Ryan Callister finished a repair shift at Voss Tower at 6 in the afternoon. The ninth-floor electrical panel had been misdiagnosed by 2 other contractors before him. He found the fault in a corroded junction behind a secondary conduit that had not been opened since the building was first commissioned, a detail that required knowing not just where to look, but why. He fixed it, repacked his tools, signed out at the front desk, and drove to the grocery store on the way home. He stood in the baking aisle longer than necessary. Claire's recipe notebook was on the second shelf of the kitchen bookcase at home, her handwriting still on every page, rounded and deliberate, with margin annotations about substitutions, in case he couldn't find a particular brand. He had placed the notebook on that shelf after she died 3 years ago, and had not touched it since. He knew her birthday cake recipe was in there. He bought the ingredients from memory and told himself he would look at the notebook another time. That same Friday evening, at Portland General Hospital on the west side of the city, Natalie Voss sat on a wooden bench in a small garden that did not appear on the visitor map. The garden occupied a narrow strip between the hospital's west wing and its service road, shaded by a row of maple trees that her father had planted as a donation when he was healthy. Edmund Voss had found this garden during an earlier hospitalization. Something minor, a procedure, years before the lung cancer, and had walked here each afternoon of that stay. Natalie had discovered it 2 months into his current treatment, the first time she needed somewhere to go after leaving his room. The oncologist had been direct that afternoon. Edmund's response to the first chemotherapy cycle had been partial, not complete, and he needed another. The doctor used words like adjustment and realistic expectations, and Natalie had nodded at each of them with the composed expression she used in board meetings, and then she had walked out here and sat down and found, for the first time in many months, that she did not know what to do next. She was 36 years old. She ran a company with 400 employees, managed a capital portfolio larger than some city budgets, and had not cried in a doctor's office since she was a child. She did not cry now. She sat on the bench and watched the light go flat over the hospital's west wing and stayed until she felt capable of going back. What she did not yet know was that this garden would soon have a second regular visitor. Portland General's outpatient pediatric unit was housed in the same wing. Sophie Callister had been admitted 10 days earlier for outpatient treatment of pneumonia, not severe enough to require overnight admission, but stubborn enough to need daily monitoring. Ryan dropped her off each morning before his shift and picked her up each afternoon. Sophie tolerated the waiting room for approximately 40 minutes before she located the side door that a nurse sometimes propped open with a brick and let herself out. The first time Natalie saw her, Sophie was already seated at the far end of the bench, hospital bracelet on her left wrist, pencil in her right hand, a folded square of paper napkin balanced on her knee. She had not asked permission to sit there. She had simply sat down in the way that certain children occupy space completely, without apology, without apparent awareness that any arrangement to the contrary was possible. Natalie looked at the child. The child did not look up. Natalie watched the pencil move across the napkin in small, careful strokes. After a moment, she said, "What are you drawing?" Sophie looked up and considered the question with brief seriousness, as if verifying it deserved a real answer. "A building," she said. "Dad designed it, but he doesn't work there anymore." "What does he do now?" "Fixes electricity," Sophie said, and went back to her pencil. There was a particular quality to the quiet that followed, not awkward, not waiting to be filled. Natalie sat in it without reaching for something to say. She was not accustomed to leaving silences alone. In every other part of her life, she moved to fill them. Here, something told her not to. Sophie drew for several more minutes, then looked up again and asked who Natalie was visiting. "My father," Natalie said. Sophie nodded. "My dad visits me here. He always brings a sandwich because he says hospital food is bad." She paused and appeared to consider. "It is bad." Natalie laughed quick and unplanned, before she had decided to. It was the first time she had laughed in several days, and it surprised her, and she let the surprise pass without comment. That evening, she returned to Edmund's room. He was sitting up, which was a good sign on the afternoons he managed it. He looked at her the way he always looked, reading something she did not know she was showing. "You look better than when you came in," he said. She told him she had met a child in the garden. Edmund smiled without hurry. "Children have that effect," he said. She sat with him for another hour, and when she left she felt something she had not felt in weeks, that the afternoon had been, in some small and specific way, all right. She went home that night and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. She told herself she was working through email, and she was working through email, and something in the back of her mind was still sitting on a bench in a hospital garden, listening to a child describe a building her father had designed. Sophie came back the following afternoon, and the one after that. She did not announce herself or check whether Natalie would be there. She appeared at the same bench in the same afternoon window, as if the arrangement were obvious and did not need to be discussed. Natalie began arriving by 3:15. She did not examine this adjustment closely. They talked in the way of people who are not performing conversation. Sophie's preferred breakfast foods, whether pigeons were stubborn or merely patient, the precise difference between a skyscraper and a high-rise, which Sophie considered a meaningful distinction and had opinions about. Natalie listened without redirecting. In her daily life, she redirected constantly conversations, negotiations, her own attention. Here, she let the conversation go where Sophie took it and found this to be, unexpectedly, a significant relief. Sophie told her about her father in fragments and without a particular order, the way children report things they consider important without worrying whether a listener can follow the sequence. That Ryan woke very early and made coffee before anything else. That he was quiet in a way that was not the same as sad, even though he was sometimes sad. That he used to draw buildings with pencils on actual paper, not on a computer, and that she had kept some of those drawings in a folder under her bed. She said this without drama, as simple fact, the way she might report the contents of a drawer. She also said that her mother had liked the building her father designed, had gone to see it when it was still under construction, before she got sick. Sophie said this with the same flatness she applied to most facts about her mother, and Natalie did not rush to respond. She let the sentence sit in the air between them, which seemed to be what Sophie preferred. One afternoon near the end of her treatment, Sophie unfolded a napkin and held it up for Natalie to see properly. It was a facade elevation, a tall building rendered in careful lines, with a deliberate asymmetry along the upper third of the east face. The proportions were precise in the way that indicated memory rather than invention. A child does not draw load-bearing geometry accurately by guessing. Someone had taught her to see this building. "This is Dad's building," Sophie said. "He designed it, but now he fixes the electricity there." Natalie studied the drawing for a moment. "What's it called?" she asked. "Voss Tower," Sophie said, and returned to her pencil. Natalie kept her expression neutral and said something without content, and waited until she was alone that evening to open her laptop. The original Voss Tower project archive was still on the company server. Lead architect of record, R. Callister, Harlan and Associates. She searched the name. The public record was nearly empty. The firm had dissolved in 2021. Professional profiles had been removed or gone inactive. She found one result, a short feature in an architectural journal from 2020, a piece on emerging Pacific Northwest voices, with a photograph taken at a construction site. The man in the photograph was younger, with an expression that had not yet acquired the particular quality of stillness that comes from carrying something heavy for years. But the face was recognizable. She sat with the photograph on her screen for a long time. The day Sophie was discharged, she came to the garden to say goodbye, wearing her own clothes and her purple backpack. She offered the napkin drawing to Natalie. "You can keep it. Dad has lots more." Natalie accepted it carefully. Sophie slung her thumbs under her backpack straps. "Dad's taking me to Aldrich's for my birthday," she said, without particular weight, the way she reported most things. "Mom used to take me there. He's been saving up." She waved and walked back toward the main entrance without looking back. Natalie sat on the bench a few minutes after she was gone, the folded napkin in her hand, aware that she was holding more than a drawing. The reservation was for 7 in the evening. Ryan had Sophie ready by 6:45 because she wanted to leave early, and he did not argue with that. He parked 2 blocks away and they walked together along the lit sidewalk, Sophie keeping pace beside him the way she always had, not rushing ahead, not trailing, simply walking next to him with the quiet steadiness of a child who has decided her father's pace is the right one. They stood outside the door of Aldrich's for a moment before going in. The front windows were warm. The sound from inside was the low murmur of a room where people were comfortable and unhurried. Ryan looked at the door. Sophie looked at the door. Neither of them said what both of them knew, that the last time this door had opened for Sophie, her mother had been there to hold it. Ryan opened the door and they went in. Marco was the manager on the Friday evening shift and had been for 4 years. In that time, he had developed a reliable visual shorthand for the room, who was celebrating, who was negotiating, who had made a reservation they could not quite afford, who belonged, and who had walked in from somewhere else. He looked at Ryan's shirt acceptable, and then his eyes moved to the boots and stayed there. He had the expression of a man who has already reached a conclusion before beginning to speak. He said it at the volume of a person confident in his authority. "Sir, we have a dress code here. I'm going to have to ask you take your daughter and leave." Sophie looked at Marco. She had the particular stillness of a child who has already survived something harder than a restaurant. She looked at the tables of people who had turned to look at her. She looked at her father. Ryan's hand came to rest on her shoulder. "Okay," he said. One syllable. He had already begun turning toward the door. There was no argument, no raised voice, no attempt to explain. The absence of any of that was the thing that made it difficult to witness the sight of a man who had long since accepted that arguing was a form of energy better spent elsewhere, steering his daughter back toward the door without making her feel the weight of it. Natalie was at her corner table when it happened. She came to Aldrich's on Friday evenings after visiting Edmund, ordered the salmon, opened her laptop, worked until 8, when the restaurant filled past the point of concentration. She heard the manager's voice and looked up. She recognized Sophie before she recognized the situation, the posture, the careful stillness, the slight tension in the child's jaw that was the visible effort of not crying in public. Natalie put her phone face down on the table and stood up and crossed the dining room. She went to Sophie first. She crouched down to the level of the child's face. "Hey," she said. "Happy birthday." Sophie looked at her. The recognition moved across her face, and then she smiled sudden and complete, the kind of smile that children produce when something genuine surprises them past their defenses. Ryan looked at the woman kneeling on the floor before his daughter in the middle of a silent restaurant. He did not know who she was. He only knew that she had looked at Sophie first, not at him, not at the room at Sophie. Natalie straightened and turned to Marco. "She's my guest," she said. "Both of them are." Her voice was the voice she used in rooms where people needed to understand something was not negotiable. Marco looked at her face, and then the recognition spread through the staff near the host station, Natalie Voss. The regular, the one who always got the corner, and the room understood that an error had been made that could not be corrected, only absorbed. Ryan still did not know any of this. He stood with his hand on Sophie's back and watched a stranger hold open a door that had been closed, and he walked his daughter through it. The table Natalie led them to was hers, 4 seats, corner, away from the center of the room, with the kind of natural privacy that comes from a good position rather than a barrier. Sophie opened the menu with focused seriousness. The conversation started with her, as conversations involving Sophie generally did. She explained to Ryan about the garden at Portland General, the bench, the maple trees, the woman who had been there every afternoon at the same time. Ryan listened. Natalie listened to Sophie, describe her, and did not fill in what Sophie left out. They talked about the hospital, about the birthday, about Sophie's napkin drawings. Neither adult introduced the subject of who they were to each other or what they did. The absence of that conversation felt, to both of them, correct. They ordered. The food came. Natalie did not explain her title, and Ryan did not ask for it. When the check came, Ryan reached for it, and Natalie had already settled it. Ryan looked at her. "You didn't have to." Natalie said, "I know." He accepted this with a single nod, the nod of a man who does not perform gratitude but does not withhold it either, who knows the difference between a gesture that requires a response and one that simply is what it is. In the car on the way home, Sophie fell asleep before they cleared the first intersection, one cheek against the window, her hands loose in her lap. Ryan drove in the quiet. At a red light, he reached back to adjust Sophie's jacket and felt something fall from her pocket onto the seat beside her. He picked it up. A business card, clean white stock, plain black text, Natalie Voss, Chief Executive Officer, Voss and Harlan Development. He looked at it for the length of one red light. Then the light changed and he drove the rest of the way home with the card on the passenger seat and put it in the zippered pocket of his jacket when he carried Sophie upstairs and left it there. The next morning at Voss and Harlan's offices on the 14th floor, a junior assistant mentioned in passing, during a conversation about something else entirely, that Miss Voss had been seen the previous evening at Aldrich's with a man and a young child. Derek Paulson filed this the way he filed everything as data of indeterminate value, pending context. He asked the assistant for the name of the restaurant. He called Marco. The description came back. Work boots, navy shirt, name on the reservation was Callister. Derek ran the name through the contractor management system. Ryan Callister. Electrician. On contract through Meridian Maintenance, currently assigned to Voss Tower. Derek did not know, at this stage, that Ryan had originally designed the building he now maintained. What he knew was more immediately useful. Natalie Voss had spent a Friday evening in a restaurant with a contract worker and had apparently intervened on his behalf in a public situation. This was the kind of information that could be shaped, depending on what it turned out to be. He called Carol Finch, who had managed Meridian's contracts with Voss and Harlan for 11 years and knew the paperwork of every person who had ever worked on their properties. "Who is Ryan Callister?" "Really?" he asked. Carol paused before answering. The pause lasted 3 seconds longer than it should have. Derek noted it. He noted silences the way other people noted statements, as information in a different form. Carol said Callister was a competent electrician, reliable, nothing on file. Derek thanked her and ended the call. Carol sat at her desk afterward and looked at the renewal form for Callister's contract that she had been about to process before the phone rang, and she did not process it. Natalie, that same morning, opened the original Voss Tower project archive on her office computer and went through it carefully for the first time in years. The full drawing set was their site plans, floor plates, elevations, sections, structural coordination documents, all bearing a handwritten signature across the title block on each page. R. Callister, Harlan, and Associates. She pulled up the east elevation and placed Sophie's napkin beside it on her desk. The proportions were the same. The asymmetry along the upper third, a diagonal shift she had always assumed was a simple aesthetic choice, the kind of gesture architects made to break symmetry on less prominent faces, was rendered identically in the napkin in the hand of an 8-year-old who had been taught to see it from across a dinner table. Natalie traced the load path through the structural documents until she understood why the asymmetry was where it was and what it was doing there. The aesthetic was not primary. The drawing on the napkin had known that. Then she took the elevator to the 14th floor. Ryan was replacing a breaker panel at the end of the east corridor. The door to the electrical room was open. He had his back to her, both hands inside the panel. He turned when she said his name, not his first name, just Callister, the way you address someone when you have been thinking of them in terms of a file, and looked at her without surprise. "The east facade," she said. "The asymmetry in the upper third. Was it structural or aesthetic?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was neither guarded nor open, something more deliberate than either. "Both," he said. "The load path runs diagonal under that panel. The aesthetic was secondary." She nodded slowly. "You designed this building." It was not a question. He answered it anyway. "That was a different time." He turned back to the panel. She stood in the doorway a moment longer, then walked back to the elevator. The sentence stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon in a way she could not account for. 2 days later, Derek called Carol into his office and closed the door. He instructed her to terminate Ryan Callister's contract with Meridian by the end of the month. For the paperwork, the reason was restructuring. Carol asked why. Derek said Callister was becoming a distraction. Carol returned to her desk, opened the termination form, and looked at it for a long time. She closed it without filling it in. This was the first time in 9 years that she had not completed a task Derek gave her. That evening, Ryan came home to find Sophie at the kitchen table. A new set of napkin drawings spread across it. He sat down, and after a moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed the business card on the table between them. Sophie looked at it. "That's Miss Natalie's card," she said. "I know," Ryan said. Sophie looked at him for a moment. "She's nice." He nodded. "Yeah." He left the card on the table when he went to make dinner, and he did not put it away. Natalie had not been watching the operating numbers out of suspicion. She had been watching them out of thoroughness, a habit she had learned from Edmund, who reviewed every document placed in front of him with the attention of someone who understood that carelessness in detail was how large things went wrong. She had noticed, over several months, a pattern she could not precisely articulate. Approval sequences that bypassed the dual signature requirement, the company's bylaws mandated for expenditures above a certain threshold, line items classified in categories broad enough to make itemization optional. She had raised it once, obliquely, in a meeting. Derek had explained it smoothly, citing operational efficiency. She had accepted the explanation and gone back to her desk and spent the following week unable to explain to herself why the answer had not satisfied her. She contacted an independent accounting firm through her personal email. She provided 3 years of operating data and asked for a full reconciliation of all maintenance and facilities expenditures against actual contracts on record. She told no one at the company. The report came back in 9 days. $1.2 million over 3 years had been classified under a heading called operational contingency, a classification that required no itemization and, in practice, had received none. The funds had been transferred quarterly to a company called Halcyon Services, LLC, registered in Delaware. A standard beneficial ownership search revealed one of Halcyon's silent shareholders, Derek Paulson. Natalie read the report twice at her desk. She put it in a physical folder and the folder in her bag and drove home. She did not sleep particularly well. The next morning, she sent a board meeting request for the following Thursday and did not give a reason in the subject line. Derek, when he received the notification, sent his own meeting request for that same morning, emergency agenda, subject listed as executive leadership concerns. He arrived in the conference room early and spent the time before others arrived moving around the table. He had spoken individually to 3 board members the previous day and knew where the room's weight would sit. When the board filed in, he opened by invoking his authority under the governance charter to raise concerns about executive conduct. He described, in measured neutral language, what he called a pattern of divided attention. Natalie's focus drawn away from a critical M&A pipeline by what he characterized as a personal relationship with a contract worker. He referenced Carol's observations about the contractor's name appearing in executive conversations. He presented it as a leadership concern, not a personal attack, in the tone of a man doing an unpleasant duty. 3 board members were nodding. 2 others were unreadable. The room's weight was moving in the direction Derek had prepared it to move. Natalie opened her laptop and connected to the room's display. One slide appeared a single table of figures, 3 columns, 3 years. "Before we discuss my personal life," she said, "let's discuss this." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the expected shape of a situation suddenly changes. She walked them through it without theater. The $1.2 million, the operational contingency classification, the absence of required dual signature approvals, the Halcyon LLC transfers, Derek Paulson's name in the beneficial ownership record. Derek said it was a classification error. He said the word misunderstanding twice. He had navigated difficult rooms before, and he leaned now on the composure that had always served him in them. Natalie placed a printed email on the table in front of the board chair. Derek's instructions to Carol Finch to terminate Ryan Callister's contract, sent 48 hours after Natalie had first inquired about the electrician's professional background. "This is retaliation against someone whose name came up during my investigation into these accounts," she said. "It happened the day after I asked who the electrician was." The board chair called for a vote. The suspension passed 7-2. Derek left the room without speaking. In the hallway, he made a phone call. His voice was very controlled. What the board expected after the meeting was a press statement. What the communications team expected was a call. What the company's legal counsel expected was a meeting to plan next steps. What Natalie did was pick up her bag and her keys and walk through the lobby and out to the parking garage and drive across the city. She did not call ahead. She drove to a residential building on Portland's east side, in a neighborhood where the apartment complexes had been built in the 1970s and the maple trees along the sidewalk were old enough to have real mass. She found the right buzzer and pressed it. She stood in the concrete entryway and listened to the building's quiet and thought about the fact that she was doing something she had not planned and could not have predicted herself doing 12 hours ago, and decided this was probably the most honest thing she had done in some time. Ryan's voice came through the intercom on the second ring. "Yeah? It's Natalie Voss," she said. A pause. Then the door buzzed open. He was in the hallway when she stepped off the elevator. Gray t-shirt, hair uncombed, the look of a man who had been home for an hour after a morning shift. Sophie was visible at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a napkin and a pencil. She looked up when she saw Natalie, and her face opened. "Miss Natalie," she said, and returned to the cereal. Ryan looked at Natalie with the expression of a man who had expected this conversation to happen at some point and had not known when. He stepped back from the doorway and she came in. She told him his contract was secure. She told him she was sorry for what had happened at the restaurant. Ryan said, "You weren't the one who said it." Natalie said, "No. But I should have said something sooner about a lot of things." She said it simply, without hedging. He looked at her for a moment, deciding whether it was true, not whether it was gracious. He moved back from the doorway, and she came in. She told him about the board meeting. The audit, the numbers, Derek, the vote. Ryan listened without interrupting, without performing reaction, with the quality of attention he seemed to bring to most things complete and without performance. When she finished, he said, "Is it handled?" "The investigation is ongoing," she said. "But yes." She set an envelope on the kitchen table. "Voss and Harlan is moving forward on a second tower. The board approved the concept months ago. We still don't have an architect." She looked at the envelope rather than at him. "You don't have to answer now or at all." Ryan looked at the envelope without picking it up. "Why me?" Natalie looked directly at him. "Because the first building is still standing," she said, "and I want to know if that was luck or intention." The kitchen was quiet. Sophie had stopped drawing. She was looking at her cereal bowl with the particular attention of a child who is listening to everything and understands that the right response is to appear not to. "It wasn't luck," Ryan said. Something settled in the room, small, quiet, without ceremony. Sophie stood, carried her bowl to the sink, walked back past Natalie, and patted the back of her hand once with her small, warm palm. "You should stay for breakfast," she said, and returned to the table and picked up her pencil. Ryan and Natalie looked at each other across the kitchen. Neither said anything. After a moment, Natalie pulled out a chair and sat down. The investigation completed in 14 days. Derek Paulson was terminated with cause on a Wednesday morning. The file was transferred to an independent auditing firm engaged by the board. There was no final confrontation, no public accounting, no speech. There was a cardboard box carried out of the corner office that overlooked the Willamette River, and a name removed from the company directory, and a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later when the 14th floor felt marginally different and no one could say precisely why. Justice, when it arrives through institutional process rather than dramatic confrontation, tends to look like administration. Carol found Ryan in the parking garage 2 days after Derek's termination. She had rehearsed this for several days, and it came out less organized than she had planned. She said she was sorry not for the restaurant. She was specific about that, because she had not been there. She was sorry for the time before that, for knowing what Derek was doing with the contractor renewals and staying quiet because it was easier, and taking too long to understand that staying quiet was not neutrality. Ryan listened. He said, "You were protecting your job. I understand that." He did not say it was all right, because it was not entirely all right, and he was not a man who said things that were not true to make a moment easier to leave. He said it without anger, acknowledged what she had said, and went back to loading his truck. She went to her car. It was enough. That weekend, Natalie sat beside her father's hospital bed and talked to him the way she had not been able to for months, without editing, without managing his worry, by managing her own disclosures. She told him about the audit, about Derek, about the board. She told him about Ryan Callister and the building Edmund had commissioned during the years when Voss and Harlan was still finding its scale. The building a young architect had designed with real attention and then walked away for after his wife died, and had been maintaining as an electrician ever since without telling anyone. Edmund listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The little girl who used to sit in the garden, her father." Natalie said yes. Edmund looked at the ceiling and the way he did when he was working something through. "She's a good judge of character," he said. "She is," Natalie said. They sat together for another hour in the particular quiet of a room where a great deal has been said and nothing more needs to be. That night, just after 9, Natalie's phone rang. She was at her kitchen table with a glass of water and a report she had not been reading. "Ryan Callister." She answered. "I read the brief," he said. "The east parcel has a drainage problem you haven't accounted for. The grade drops 4 feet over 60 feet of lot line. The preliminary siting plan doesn't address it." She turned the unread report face down. She was smiling, alone in her kitchen. "Can you come in Thursday?" she said. "I'll bring Sophie," he said. "She'll want to see the site." "I know," Natalie said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, and then good night, and the call ended. She sat at the table a few minutes longer. The window above the sink showed the city's lights against a dark sky. Something that had been compressed for a long time in her chest had, in the last several weeks, been slowly and carefully opening. She was not sure yet what it would become. She thought she could wait to find out. 3 months later, Ryan signed a contract with Voss and Harlan. The title was his own condition: Design Integrity Consultant. He completed his remaining Meridian assignments before handing them off, not because the money required it, but because he had started things and he finished them. Sophie asked whether the new arrangement meant moving apartments, was told it did not, and returned to her drawing. On a Tuesday afternoon in late October, with the maple trees outside Portland General turned copper and amber, Sophie sat on the wooden bench in the West Garden and drew. She was not sick. She was there because Natalie had been visiting Edmund, and Ryan had come with her, and Sophie had come with Ryan. The hospital held for her, now, the quality of a place where something had begun that she could not name but recognized as important. Natalie came through the side door and sat down beside her. "What are you drawing?" She asked the same words as the first time. The same bench, the same afternoon light. Sophie held up the napkin. 2 tall towers stood on either side of a space, and centered between them was a smaller structure with a flat roofline covered in small, careful marks that suggested plantings. "That's the new one," Sophie said. "Dad said it needs a garden on the roof because buildings need to breathe." Natalie looked at the drawing, then looked up at the third-floor window on the west face of the hospital, where through the glass she could see Ryan sitting beside Edmund's bed. They were talking. Edmund's hands were moving the way they did when he was making a point he considered important. Ryan was listening in the way he always listened, without performance, without impatience, simply present. Upstairs, Edmund was mid-sentence when Ryan looked out the window and saw them on the bench below. Sophie bent over her drawing, Natalie beside her, both of them still in the gold afternoon light. Edmund stopped talking and followed his gaze. He looked for a moment, then looked back at Ryan. "You're good for her," he said, without preamble or qualification. "She stopped pretending when she's around you." Ryan looked at the 2 figures on the bench a moment longer. "She's good for both of us," he said. He went downstairs. He walked through the side door and across the stone path and sat down on the far side of Sophie, who was in the middle of the bench as she always was. Natalie slid the napkin across Sophie's lap to him. He picked it up and looked at it, the 2 towers, the smaller building between them, the rooftop garden in Sophie's approximate, earnest lines. He looked at it for a while without speaking. Then he noticed what was written at the bottom, in the rounded, uneven letters Sophie used when she printed by hand. "All of ours." Nobody said anything. The wind moved through the maple trees, the same trees that had been dropping leaves in this garden since before any of them had stood in it. Sophie picked up her pencil and began a new drawing on a fresh square of napkin, working with the quiet focus of someone who has found the thing she intends to keep doing. The October light lay gold across all 3 of them, and none of them needed it to be anything other than what it was.